So again, welcome to the Paul S. Sarbanes Transit in the Parks Technical Assistance Center Alternative Transportation Systems Training for Federal Land Management Agencies webinar series. My name is Amber Reep and I will be your moderator for today. Today's presentation title is Good Practices to Encourage Bicycling and Pedestrians on Federal Lands. And we have quite a few presenters. We have Natalie Vilwalk-Whitty, who's a research engineer with the Western Transportation Institute. We have Davis Farrer, who's a principal with Western Slope Consulting. We have Dan Dressler, who's a park ranger at Mississippi National River and Recreational Area. And we also have Charles Borders, who is a branch chief at the National Capital and Southeast regions of the Denver Service Center. So welcome to all of you, and without any further ado, I will hand the presentation over to Natalie to review the agenda and get started.
Thank you, Amber. So today our presentation is going to be divided up where first we're going to discuss essentially the benefits of integrated bicycle and pedestrian modes into a federal land management unit network. We're going to look at the 11 parts of the good practices to encourage bicycling and pedestrians on federal lands, divided into the 4 sections that you see here. And within the sections, our presenters will be adding their input as well. Davis will be coming in at some small portions within section 1, 2, and 4. And then Dan will be talking in section 3 under the encouragement, education, and enforcement programs. And Charles will be talking about information pertaining to the evaluation and monitoring sections. So just make sure you stay tuned for those. As I mentioned, I'm going to start out by discussing the benefits of integrating bicycle and pedestrian systems into existing transportation networks. So one of the benefits is the resource protection aspect of it, because bicycle and pedestrian systems require less space than, say, their counterparts of other transportation modes. As you can see here in the photo on the right, which is taken from Boise, Idaho, the bicycle and pedestrian network that you can see would take up less space. You can imagine how a vehicle would require a lot more space than that shown here. They also reduce greenhouse gas emissions in a sense because bicycle and pedestrians, of course, do not require emissions. And they improve the visitor enjoyment and health. A lot of times, surveys and results that have been done in the past have shown that visitors feel like they get closer to attractions, and it brings a much more substantial visit in their memory. And also because they're powering, whether themselves or a bicycle, it also brings additional health benefits. It's a financially sustainable means because you do not have to worry as much, say, about rolling stock when you compare it to other transit options. And it helps to further ecological balance because there's a smaller footprint. So this leads into the first poll question that we have. How many miles of bike paths do you have in your town or federal land? Do you have 0, between 0 and 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, or greater than 40?
Okay, it looks like we have most of the responses in, so I'm going to close the poll and show the results.
So great, it looks like we have a lot of examples that have more than 40 miles of bike paths within a town or federal land, a few people that have none, and then some that have some in between, so great representation. So as I mentioned, we have it 4 sections. This first section is going to talk about 2 of the 11 parts of the document, and Davis will again be providing some additional insight in this particular section. The first component is needs assessment. Needs assessment can be identifying bicycle and pedestrian transportation related needs within the unit or within the unit and how it connects to the gateway community. And I should define gateway community. It's essentially a community that tends to be the access point to a particular federal land unit. One of the closer examples to where I am here in New Mexico would be Rocky Mountain National Park is pretty familiar, and the east side gateway community would be Estes Park. Needs to help to feed into the goals, which we'll discuss later. And needs, a big part of needs assessment is the public participation, and there's two common avenues that are used to obtain public participation. One is workshops, and the second is surveys. So as an example, we found for the Cape Cod Integrated Bicycle Feasibility Study, they actually facilitated a workshop to provide input for this particular study itself. Other examples for surveys include the Ridge to Rivers partnership up in Boise, Idaho. They've done some surveys that helped gain input that they have support for bicycle lane funding. They also found that they were able to estimate the number of potential users of the network. And as another example, in the TripTech document, their case study of the North Moab Recreation Area, they discuss a survey that was done to show support for bicycle lane facilities. The second component of the document itself is partnerships. Partnerships are arrangements that are voluntary, mutually beneficial, and entered into for the purpose of mutually agreed upon objectives. So really some of the benefit of partnering is to accomplish a lot with a little because you have a lot more resources. Because you're looking at a diverser amount of potential input, you have fresh ideas, opportunities, and solutions. You can also draw on additional expertise that you may not otherwise have and resources as well. It also can potentially identify other funding sources because you have a lot more people that may hear of other funding sources that you might not otherwise be aware of. And you can have assistance with grant applications. So two examples of this would be the Moab Trails Alliance. They help to write proposals for the Grand County Non-Motorized Trails Master Plan, which is in Moab. And the Great Basin Institute helped to develop the National Environmental Policy Act documents to support the Lake Tahoe Region Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan. As a more specific example, Davis Ferrer will be talking about a memorandum of understanding that was developed between the Red Hill Council and the Bureau of Land Management. So Davis, would you like to describe more?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. We have a pretty good group here participating. You can see a little bit about my background on my bio that you can download, but let me give you a brief overview. I was a town manager in Carbondale for about 13 years. I'm presently a land planning consultant on the western slope of Colorado, and Carbondale is located, I'll show you a map here in a minute, just outside of Glenwood Springs, between Glenwood Springs and Aspen, Colorado, if you know where that is. I'm currently president of the Red Hill Council, and with this slide I'll get you oriented to where Red Hill is. On the left-hand side of the screen here where the pointer is, this is the Red Hill area. It's 3,000 acres of BLM land. We have built with volunteers approximately 20 plus miles of trails. It's non-motorized. And it's used rather heavily, particularly the southern area that I'm pointing out here, which is closest to Carbondale, is just south here off the map. But this is the sort of main intersection to Carbondale, and there's a parking lot right here. And most folks from Carbondale and the valley will use this part of Red Hill during lunch in the morning or in the evenings for a quick run, a workout, and then for folks that want to have a longer experience, they'll actually use the larger trail system. And it takes quite a while. This first part here, as you can see from the topo, is fairly steep, and you can see from this picture of Red Hill. So it's a workout to get up here, and then once you're up on top, it's not too difficult. And back in here, to do the entire loop is about a 4.5-hour mountain bike ride. That's my particular bent. But we have hikers, walkers, folks that walk their dogs, long-distance runners, and mountain bikers that use this area frequently. Red Hill is located here near Glenwood Springs. This is Denver. I think everybody can see this pointer. Can you see my pointer? I hope so. Anyway, it's about 3.5 hours from Denver in the central portion of the state. And then, again, this is the picture of Red Hill in the lower right-hand corner. To give you an idea about use on Red Hill, this chart here is a graph of user days These are round trips. We have a counter at the main trailhead, and I would note that in 2012 we've had some problems with our trail counter not working, so these numbers on the very end here are not real accurate. But the other numbers represent the increase in use over time, and you can see that there's use year-round. In the early years, there wasn't a whole lot of use, and it continues to increase. Some of these taller bar graphs here are probably errors. The counter might have been a little too sensitive and was counting vibrations. It's a vibratory counter, so it was double counting, folks. But in any case, the overall trend is upwards. We register around 55,000 user days a year on Red Hill. This next graph, area chart, shows the average round trips per day by month from 2003 to 2005. And we are located, our elevation is 6,200 feet above sea level is our base parking lot elevation, and the top is about 7,400 feet. So in our area, when winter comes, our trails stay open later and open earlier in the spring, whereas trails in Aspen or south near Marble, Colorado, and other places, they remain snowed in or they snow in early in the season. So once the surrounding trails are closed, we get a lot of use. And you can see here in May and June, there's a major peak. And then as we work through the summer, the warmer months, use drops off, and also the other trails open up so folks can get there. And then later in the year, it cools off, and it's more fun to use Red Hill. So this kind of gives you an idea about the use of Red Hill and seasonal change. So Red Hill SRMA, why did we use a memorandum of understanding? Well, they're basically, with BLM, we are a private nonprofit volunteer organization that works closely with BLM. And when we first started in the entire process on Red Hill, we frankly really didn't know what we were doing. As we met with BLM representatives, we found out more about their process and how it relates to us. And one of the first steps was developing a memorandum of understanding which established our relationship with BLM and our respective roles. The MOU is one of two options available. The other one is what they call an assistance agreement, and we didn't use that form of document because those are really intended for transfer of money between two agencies, provision of services, transfer of property, and generally exchanging items of value. In our case, it was simply providing services and working in conjunction with BLM to accomplish our objectives. As I mentioned, the MOU is really a primary way to formalize a cooperative agreement between two agencies. And it lays out the roles and responsibilities of each of the involved groups. So in our case, it said, okay, the Red Hill Council will have monthly meetings. We will help coordinate volunteers. We will solicit people to do trail maintenance, trail work, those kinds of exercises. And then BLM's role was to provide a representative for us at our meetings, would work with us on volunteer work days, and so on and so forth. So that's why we use the MOU, and it's been a fairly effective method of establishing our relationship. So this image here is a picture of our MOU signing party. It's not really champagne. I think it's fake champagne, but it was a very significant accomplishment for us and for the BLM because we had started off on a very informal basis as a group of citizens looking at Red Hill and how it's to be used, and this MOU was the culmination of those initial efforts. So as I mentioned before, it formalized our relationship between the Red Hill Council and the BLM. There was an implementation plan associated with the MOU, and part of that came out of our SRMA. And let me just explain what that stands for the folks that don't work with BLM. It's a Special Recreation Management Area. That's a classification that BLM has for locations where they will focus more attention for management, for financial support, and overall attention versus other areas in their resource where they, there's millions of acres actually in their resource area, and so this helps them define where their energies are focused. As I mentioned, the to-do list was a series of tasks. We've accomplished most of them at this point in time. They were set forth in the SRMA documents that were adopted as part of establishing that classification. And it's just the MOU, as I mentioned before, is a way to enhance our cooperative environment. It is also not intended to bind either party in a negative way. It's intended to be really a positive instrument that allows people to focus on what they want to be doing and what they want to accomplish, as opposed to creating some kind of penalty for not doing something. It also includes a provision, an out clause, so that if either entity decides, well, this isn't working for them, they can opt out with a certain amount of notice. So far, we've not opted out, and that's working very well. So that sort of concludes my first phase of the presentation here.
Great. Thank you, Davis. So we're actually going to pause for just a few moments to see if anybody has any questions. If you're joining us via the computer and you'd like to type in your question, you can use the Q&A drop-down manager. Or if you are joining us via telephone and you'd like to speak to one of the presenters directly, you can press *8 on your telephone keypad, and that will cue you in to our queue. You'll hear a beep on your end. I'll announce your city, and then your telephone mic will be unmuted for you to ask your question, and then we'll very shortly after that remute you. So it actually looks like we have one question on the telephone so far. So from Jackson, Wyoming. Again, Jackson, Wyoming, you should hear a beep on your end, and then when you do, the mic will be open for you to ask your question to either Davis or Natalie. So Jackson, Wyoming, go ahead. All right, while they're getting connected, one of the other questions that's...
hello, sorry.
Hi.
I forgot to unmute myself. This is John Christensen, Grand Teton National Park. And I was wondering if here at Grand Teton National Park, we are finding that our pathway system, shared use pathway system, generates its own user groups, and we find that actually, although it's greatly facilitating the use of bicycles and pedestrian use here in the park, that's often not replacing vehicles on the roadway. It's actually generating vehicles who are making a trip into the park, often to use the pathway system, and that sometimes is increasing the demand for parking in our park. And I'm wondering if at Red Hill or other locations where you're finding a sort of similar type of use where it's not necessarily displacing vehicles, but having kind of other sort of effects.
This is Davis. I'll take that. That's an interesting question. In Red Hill, the primary user population comes out of Carbondale, which is within walking or riding distance to the trailhead. However, we built a parking lot in conjunction with the county and the Department of Transportation at the base of Red Hill, and that's pretty much at this point been taken over by carpoolers who travel up valley in the morning. So there is that component where the use on the trail does generate vehicle traffic. Interestingly enough, we have the town of Carbondale has been awarded a Sarbanes grant to look at connections to public transit, and there's also a regional trail system that comes by the base of Red Hill. Is about a half a mile away. And the Sarbanes grant will be looking at ways that we can use public transit, we can tie into the trail system, and we can reduce the demand for vehicles in the parking lot. It'll also be looking at easier ways for people to get across Highway 82, which is a 4-lane highway with pretty high-speed traffic that separates the base of Red Hill from Carbondale. So a lot of folks, my wife is a teacher, and when she takes 3rd and 4th graders over to Red Hill as an outdoor classroom, they always take a bus because they are not willing to put the kids at risk crossing the highway, even though there's a crosswalk and a light. So that is an issue that we're dealing with, and we're hoping that through the Sarbanes study and ultimately an implementation grant, we can look at better connections to the public transit, to perhaps an over-the-highway or under-the-highway connection to Red Hill, and reduce the automobile demand that the trail use creates.
Great, thank you, Davis. And one more question. Were the trails at Red Hill pre-existing, or were the trails constructed as part of the agreement?
There were some pre-existing trails, not very many. There was an old road that went up to the kind of the top of Red Hill that I showed you in that picture. And it was kind of used by high school kids for woodsies and things in the early days before many people were using Red Hill. And I would say at that time there was probably, maybe a mile of social trails, if you will, sort of self-starters. And we have built the balance of the trails up there, which is, as I said before, is about 20 miles.
Great. And last question before we move on. How did you procure the project funding, and what was the source?
Our project funding is pretty nominal. Originally, I solicited some money from the town of Carbondale and a local development project that would, was close enough that they thought they would be using Red Hill. And we used that money. It was about $4,000 for the Red Hill plan, if you will, and I'll be talking about that later. Since that time, that was 1996, we have received grants from the Aspen Ski Co. Environment Foundation out of Aspen, anywhere from $7,000 to $10,000 that we've used for an access study, we've used for trail management and maintenance, that kind of thing. But we're pretty much a low-budget operation, and we've done a tremendous amount with very little funding.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Davis. We'll move on to Section 2. Natalie?
Thank you, Amber. In this section, we'll discuss 4 more parts of the guide itself. And again, Davis will come in and provide a little bit of additional insight as well. So to begin, let's talk about the goals, objectives, and performance measures that go into a plan. This really helps to provide a lot of the framework for the plan in the end. Goals are usually general and brief. Objectives are quantifiable, time-specific, and measurable. And performance measures help to define the data needs. So shown here is an example from the Lake Tahoe Region Bicycle and Pedestrian Plan. They identified as one of their specific goals that they want to have a complete bicycle and pedestrian network that provides convenient access to basin destinations and destinations outside the basin. And for this, you can see that it's general and it's brief. It's one simple sentence. Then an associated objective with that particular goal was to implement 20% or approximately 45 miles of all recommended facility improvements within 5 years or by 2015. And then they had the performance measure as the number of recommended miles to be completed by 2015. You can, in other cases, have multiple objectives for one goal, and you can have multiple performance measures for one goal, but this is one specific example, and you can find more in the document itself. So the 4th component within the document is the Bicycle and Pedestrian Network Plan. We looked at numerous other plans and subsequently identified 4 steps for project prioritization. The federal land manager can choose to adopt these steps for theirs, or they could add or subtract as they saw fit. So the first step is to identify projects. Often this is done during the needs assessment phase, which we talked about earlier. And then you go on to identify rating criteria and assign criteria weights. So as an example of some criteria that you might use, Acadia National Park Hike and Trails Management Plan set forth 4 criteria. One was cultural resource values, another was the effects on natural resources. They also had the effects on communities or neighbors, and the visitor experience value was their 4th. So then subsequently you want to choose a rank and scale and rank projects. You can use scales of say 0 to 10 or 0 to 5 when you're ranking them. And then the final step is to summarize the results and develop a network maps or map. And typically the results are summarized in a table, and then the map is kind of helps with the visual aspect of it and can help show where things are. The 5th component to the guide is design guidelines. For this one, because a lot of the documents are continuously updated as more information is gathered, we generally refer you to other examples or to other plans which have good discussion of design guidelines. And so, for example, from this particular aspect, most recently that came out in 2012 was the Guide for the Development of Bicycle Facilities by the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, or AASHTO. And there's actually been some recent webinars that you can find on this particular document that talks more in depth about the different components. There's also the National Association of City Transportation Officials, or NACTO. They have an urban bikeway design guide. And because although it's focused on maybe urban, there's a lot of information in there that can actually be applied to the rural component as well. And there's also the Manual and Uniform Traffic Control Devices, or MUTCD. And then finally, National Park Service's Guide to Sustainable Mountain Trails. So these are different documents that you might find design element discussion like push buttons and lighting and so on and so forth, and they do a really good comprehensive job. The 6th component is maintenance policy and procedures, and one of my favorite quotes from reviewing different documents came from the 2008 Grand County Non-Motorized Trails Master Plan, which is in Moab, Utah, where they talked about a non-maintained trail system is worse than no trail system at all. So because maintenance is often overlooked, I thought this is a good quote to really emphasize the importance of it. You can look at both short-term and long-term maintenance activities like trash removal or seal coating. And the types of maintenance that you'll need to perform will vary by region, such as snow removal, and it'll also be dependent upon use. The frequency will dictate the amount of trail maintenance that you might need to provide. So because trail maintenance is typically not funded like the actual construction of trails, I wanted to highlight some of the creative solutions that other areas have come up with. Jackson Hole, Wyoming, they have an Adopt a Trail partnership where individuals or organizations can donate time or money. One of the more unique ones is the Acadia Trails Forever program, and really in kind of a short description of this is that the Friends group helped raise funds to match federal funds, and then annually, every year, a portion of the interest that is gained on those funds is used for maintenance. So it can be positive, and you have to keep in mind that this particular paradigm will potentially result in, lower amounts one year, maybe higher amounts another year. It depends on how much is earned. But it has been popular enough that Cuyahoga Valley National Park, Golden Gate National Recreation Area, and Great Smoky Mountains National Park have adopted the same kind of design. And now Davis will talk about Red Hills volunteer trail maintenance work parties. So Davis, if you want to tell us a little bit more about those.
Okay, will do. Volunteer work parties are really the success of Red Hill. As I mentioned before, when we first started up doing projects on Red Hill, there was about a mile's worth of trails, and now we have almost 20 or a little over 20 miles of trails. So by working with different organizations in the valley is a group called Roaring Fork Outdoor Volunteers, which we have coordinated with on a number of projects. We do some of our own volunteer projects. And it's really important to engage volunteers in these types of efforts because it builds ownership. It builds ownership by the users and builds ownership by community folks. And it's really how we get our projects completed. Initially, when we started building new trails, there was a very high level of participation, lots of excitement, and broad-based volunteer participation. This picture here on this slide shows some kids, high school kids from an alternative high school. They came up. None of them had ever done trail work before. they probably hadn't spent much time out in the woods, and our trails and places are quite remote. But they really got into it. They enjoyed the work. It was hard work, and for high school kids, sometimes hard work is new to them. But it was hard work that was fun. So that was a real reward to them, and I think that they, understood, one, what trail construction was all about, what it was like to work in a group, and focusing on things like safety and doing things properly. So that was a pretty critical piece. As I mentioned before, we often work with other organizations. BLM will oftentimes send up a supervisor to help us with crews. We typically break up into work parties so that safety is a primary element of any work crew. We don't want anybody getting hurt, and it's also a good learning experience for folks, either high school kids or adults or anybody else who is really never had the opportunity. Maybe they've been on trails, but they have never had the opportunity to actually see what the construction phase is like, or for that matter, maintenance. As time moved on and trails were built, we went into our maintenance phase. And I'd have to say that some of the interest dropped off because people like building new trails, but when it comes to just maintaining trails, it's not quite as sexy or interesting to them. So, some of our volunteer efforts dropped off. I would also note that the ratio of users to folks that actually volunteer is pretty low. There's a lot of people out there when we're on a trail work crew that will come by and say, gosh, I wish I knew when your next event was going to be. I'd love to participate. But many folks can find a better opportunity to rearrange their sock drawer rather than get out there on the trails. So we'll talk a little bit about that. This is a picture here of one of our work parties, and those, if you can see them on your screen, those little stripes in the sky, that's snow falling. So it takes a fairly dedicated and brave crew to get out there when it's freezing and it's snowing, but we usually get a turnout. This again was a group, the Roaring Fork Outdoor Volunteers, and we probably had on that day 40 to 50 folks that showed up and either worked the entire day or came and left as time moved forward. Education is an important part of trail construction. One, educating folks about the project, and that can be done through press releases. We have a local public radio station. I've been on that station several times describing our work projects. We also do a little orientation when people show up, and that we talk about safety and what we're trying to accomplish and so on and so forth. So a little guilt trip is good too, as people come by to say, hey, if you want to be involved, it would be great. We can use your help. It's important to plan these events way in advance and get some press on them early on. But if you go out too far, people will forget. They'll say, yeah, I saw the event, the sign posted or whatever. But it's important to saturate the media just before the workday starts. And we'll post signs at the trailhead. We'll post them around Carbondale, which is our primary draw area. But we'll also put things on the radio and in the newspaper as well. These events, it's really important that they're fun, that people don't get hurt, that they understand, how to carry their tools and so on. So that's an important part of each crew leader. And we usually try to assign 5 or 6 volunteers per crew leader if we have enough, so that people know what they're supposed to be doing and they can be supervised during the process. And then at the end of the day, we try to do a feed. We go to local restaurants, we get pizza, we'll get burritos, that kind of thing, and have a pretty good feast for everybody, because during the day you're working hard and you work up an appetite. And also at the end of the day, during the dinner, we can debrief, we can talk to folks and find out what they liked, what they didn't like, what they learned. And it's also, when you have a captive audience like that, you can make announcements about other trail projects and efforts. so that they know what's coming up. And that's my section on volunteers.
Great, thank you, Davis. It looks like we have one question so far, and that is, what action plan has been used to implement the recommendations of the network plan? And also, what are the operation and maintenance programs that have been established, and what is its yearly and long-term costs? There are quite a few questions in there, Davis.
Okay. Well, let's start with the first one, and that some of the terminology is a little foreign to me because my relationship with federal agencies is just simply here on Red Hill. So the action plan, can you repeat that one, first part?
Sure. What action plan has been used to implement the recommendations of the network?
Well, we've taken our implementation portion of our SRMA document and used that as a checklist. So if you want to call that our action plan, that's what we've used. Some of the things are specific to trail construction. So, for example, building segment X of the trail system, getting that completed within 3 years, that would be a target objective. Other pieces of that plan, the implementation plan, are ongoing. So, for example, maintaining trails is something we do. Maintaining our relationship with BLM is another piece of that. Working with volunteer organizations, so is another part of it. So some of the things are specific action items, others are ongoing through time. Give me the next part of that question.
What are the operation and maintenance programs that have been established, and what is the yearly and long-term costs? And then they added, this is only in regards to the Lake Tahoe system.
Okay. Somebody else better take that because I'm not familiar with the Lake Tahoe system.
So the Lake Tahoe one, they're asking about the annual costs?
Yes, the yearly and long-term costs for operation and maintenance.
I believe Lake Tahoe had an estimate in there. I remember in the actual document itself, there is an estimate of annual operating costs. And I mean, I can give you an estimate. I think I remember somewhere around 4 to 6 is what I remember reading from one specific place. But it really will depend on kind of how big your network is and what kind of network it is. So if it's a paved trail, you're going to have different maintenance needs than, say, Red Hill, which I think is predominantly more of kind of a soft trail network. So those will range, and so I would encourage you to check out the examples or contact me afterwards. There's also the emails specific to the thing, and we can try to get you more specific answers for that.
Natalie, does Karen Fink work for Lake Tahoe? Do you know?
Yes. Yes, she was our primary contact, and she's very great to get in touch with.
Oh, great. Well, she was just on the line, and had indicated that it was, I think, 1,000 to 4,000, and then unfortunately it got deleted. I don't know if Ms. Fink, you'd like to press star 8 on your telephone keypad to answer the question directly if you'd like, or we can simply move on to section 3. Okay, here we go. She wrote in, it's actually 4,000 to 14,000, and she's actually joining us via computer audio, so she can't speak on the phone, but at least we have a number now. Thank you, Karen. All right, let's move on to section 3. So, Natalie?
Thank you, Amber, and thank you, Karen, for adding that addition. And their plan is one that I'll be mentioning at the end, and we have it in our repository, so I'd encourage everybody to check it out. It's a wonderful plan. This section is the third of 4. We're going to cover 3 of 11 parts, and stay tuned because Dan Dressel will be talking about tours up in Mississippi National River and Recreation Area in St. Paul, Minnesota. So the 7th component of the document itself is pedestrian and bicycle support elements. These are particularly important because they help to promote use. On the left-hand side here, you see a photo from Rocky Mountain National Park where they have context-sensitive wayfinding information. Wayfinding information is imperative so that you have a positive visitor experience. No one wants to get lost. And it's also really important at junction points so people know which way they're going. You also, in the middle, see the bicycle parking, which is from Grand Teton. I think it probably looks familiar for some of our listeners here. You want to ensure that you provide adequate bicycle parking so that people can make use. And then on the bottom right here is basically a visual of integrated transit with bicycle and pedestrian. Is a great example in Cuyahoga Valley National Park with their Bike Aboard program, where they have the towpath trail that you can bike in one direction, and then you can take the train back in the opposite direction, and they store your bikes on the actual train itself for you. The 8th component is cost and funded analysis. This is the 8th of 11 parts. Consider when you think about cost that in Portland they were able to develop a citywide bicycle network for the cost of less than 1 mile of urban freeway. So this kind of goes back to the financial sustainability. The cost of bicycle and pedestrian networks is really a lot less than what you would have of your vehicle counterparts. Depending on what kind of network you want to think of, and keep in mind the networks can include those within the federal land unit and those connecting to, which kind of alludes to the discussion we had earlier. So it can be anywhere from bicycle routes where you're just having sign and pavement markings, which is a really low-level investment, to bicycle lanes that may need you may need to extend the curb and gutter, so it can increase the cost, all the way to sidewalks and multi-use paths. And I think this was kind of alluded to in the discussion before, where multi-use paths, some of the additional costs can be associated with those trailheads trying to accommodate the vehicles. But if you can find ways to provide access to the units via even a bicycle and pedestrian path, you can sometimes mitigate some of the need for that the parking areas. And that one can be the most substantial investment to some degree, but at the same point in time, these multi-use paths tend to draw more users than what some of the other types would. And this photo here is actually taken from Grand Teton National Park. And then one thing I should mention is, especially with as times are changing, as we know, there's a new federal transportation bill, and things will be changing in another 2 years. So you'll always want to be prepared with a cost estimate. In case you're kind of directed to a new funding source that might be useful, you want to have an idea like, I have this great project and I think it's going to cost this much. So when you see that, you can really jump on it. The next section is encouragement, education, enforcement. This is the 9 and 11 sections. You want to encourage use. You want to educate all users, not just the bicycle and pedestrians, but not just the motorists either. It's how everybody interacts and the different types of users. And you want to enforce the rules. Tours are actually a subset of encouragement, and they're a great way to introduce non-motorized facilities that visitors may otherwise be unaware of. And so Dan Dressler is going to talk about a tour up in Mississippi National River and Recreation Area in St. Paul, Minnesota. So Dan, I'll let you take it from here.
Hi, thanks for having me today. As we go on and talk just a little bit about our bike program, I have to tell you just a little bit about the park, and I apologize for this because, you know, everybody likes to talk about their park. But I think to understand how we got to our bike tour program, we have to understand the unique nature of our park. We're one of the partnership parks in the system, and our park is extremely diverse. Here's a little quick summary as we click through here. We have nearly 54,000 acres in our park, and we own about 64 of those acres. And within that, it's really the 72-mile stretch of the river as it passes through the Minneapolis-St. Paul metropolitan area, basically the river bluff to bluff. And within those 54,000 acres, of course, we own almost nothing, and about half of those 54,000 acres are publicly held by an entity other than the Park Service, be it the state, county, or one of the local city governments for park and rec purposes. And we have a huge diversity of landscapes and resources within that. The river passes through both downtown Minneapolis and downtown St. Paul. In some of the more far-flung corners of the park, we have wild backwaters. We also have historic sites like Fort Snelling throughout. And the park is stitched together by a surprisingly good network of trails, but we have about 25 different communities that the river flows through in 5 different counties, and each of one of those organizations is managing their own trail system independent of one another. So though they connect, there was no organization looking at the totality and helping folks make those connections. So as we started our program back in 2005, we were looking for an opportunity to do more interpretive programs that were aimed at the general public. Still a fairly newish park with our enabling legislation just passed in 1988, and as the park was growing in size, it had already had a well-established formal education program by this point, but not nearly much of a just general public outreach program. So that was one thing. But the other thing was is we realized that though there was this very nice system of trails along the river, the public was surprisingly not tuned into just how well connected that trail system was. And folks might know one little piece of it, or they might be very familiar with the bike trail system throughout the Minneapolis Park and Rec system that linked all the famous chain of lakes in Minneapolis together, but they stayed away from the river just because it just wasn't well known. It wasn't connected in their own minds, even though it was well connected. So we also saw these trips as a chance to do just orientation to the fantastic trail system along the river. So just a few of the statistics is that through 2011, we'd had over 110 rides scheduled with over 1,000 visitors. If you do the average on that, it's a little deceptively low because there were rides that for weather reasons or whatever didn't happen, but still consistent visitation on that. We've settled in the last few years after trying different things on we have 4 different routes that we do. So we generally start about mid-June, we go through the end of September, and we schedule a ride for every Saturday, and we basically go through our 4 routes, so 1 on each consecutive weekend, and then we start over again. We have a 3-hour time frame that we try to shoot for with our interpretive rides, and all of our 4 rides end up in the neighborhood of 9 to 14 miles in length. And we find that, with interpretive stops, that's just about the right distance. So needless to say, these aren't terribly strenuous rides. They're very family friendly, and that's who we see in our visitation too, is families all the way up to retired folk to couples without children. We limit rides to 20 riders. We've found that really, realistically, 20 riders is the maximum number of people that can actually stick together as a group and stop and hear interpretive stops without completely blocking trails. So that's just the number that nice round number we've limited it to. We've also found that it's almost essential to have 2 people assigned to the ride. So be it a combination of staff or volunteers, we've mixed it up. In recent years, we've definitely settled on more often sending 2 staff members, but we've had some success with volunteers too. And you need the staff to be out there riding in the front and doing the interpretive stuff, and you need somebody riding sweep to deal with any maintenance issues riders have, but also just for wayfinding. If you have larger groups, they get strung out too far on the trail. If you get to any tricky turns, it's just helpful to have somebody in the back to make sure that folks aren't getting lost. In the grand scheme of things, it's a really low-cost program to operate. We have a small investment in bikes that the Park Service actually owns that really don't cost that much to maintain. We've sent 2 of our rangers to the League of American Bicyclist training so that they have some safety instruction, and then every spring we do a couple of training rides so everybody knows the route and that everybody knows our interpretive pieces. But once that happens and the season actually starts in mid-June, it really only requires the staff time to go out and actually present the program. So a couple of other things here. We've strongly encouraged participants to use their own bikes. We've gone back and forth and tried various different loaner bike and rental bike schemes over the years. We can say this because our visitation is heavily locals. If you're, though we do during the summer get people coming from out of state and out of the area coming in asking about the program, even with our loaner bikes available, we've just found that largely those folks from out of town aren't showing up. The people who are actually showing up are local people here in the Twin Cities metro area, and so our loaner schemes have been complicated and a headache and lots of times not worked well, and so that's why we have that, though we do have a way to deal with loaner bikes now. We have some safety protocols, including they must wear helmets, and we do ask them to pre-register for trips. We ask them to register by calling our visitor center, or this year we had an online system. So it's free, but this just keeps us within our 20-person ideal size of group, and then it also gives us the opportunity to give more detailed instructions for those people who are coming out, right down to we send them, and if you look at the downloads, you'll see there's a download there called Harriet Island Rider Letter. We send a rider letter for each route, and we email it to them. It gives some basic instructions about the ride and what's going to happen and where to meet. So that's another advantage of having pre-registration. Moving on from there, some helpful considerations, things we've learned. Again, don't mean to beat a dead horse here, but loaner bikes are a nightmare. So, be careful on that. It's the maintenance. It's figuring out how to get people the right size bike for riders. But if, you want to contact me later on about more specifics, I'd be happy to talk about that. Also, good publicity is a must. Our registration has lived and died by getting some media attention. We live in a large metropolitan area, and there's a lot going on here, and so though we make a push every spring and early summer to get some publicity, sometimes it doesn't always happen. In the years when it does happen, we've been featured, in the Saturday morning show of a local TV station. We get really good registration. The Minneapolis Star-Tribune wrote a newspaper article that they didn't publish until August, but once they published that, then the rest of our rides filled up within 2 days of the publication of that. So it's been really, really helpful to get publicity on that, and sometimes it's been a little difficult for us, but it's helped because we've also found that since we do 4 different routes, we have a surprisingly high number of riders that once they register for one ride, then they call back the next week and register for the other route. So we think we're doing something right because we do get people who go on the rotation of 2 to all 4. A controversial statement, hardcore bikers are not interested in an interpretive ride. If they are, they'll just come on and be happy to go on the family-friendly interpretive ride. Early on, we got a lot of feedback from people that they were interested in a more rigorous, strenuous ride, and we experimented for 2 years with a route that was a shorter route over a greater distance that had some really big bluffs, at least by Minnesota standards, going up and down, and our registration for those was just pitiful, and we got people who were just interested in going on the ride and really weren't up to the strenuous part, and so we've just stopped and we've just said they're slow, family-friendly rides, and we consider our routes and make sure that they're appropriate. You really do need 2 staff people to effectively pull it off. Again, if one of them is a volunteer, I think that's perfectly acceptable too. Train the staff and volunteers. It seems self-evident, but as I mentioned earlier, we put all our ride leaders through this League of American Bicyclists safety course. It's really increased their confidence to lead rides. Most of our rides are almost exclusively on trail and very little on roads, but it really is a confidence issue. We also put our volunteers through the same course, and it helps immensely. And it also blends into our following point, which is don't assume people know how to bike. We have offered our program to some of our community centers in Minneapolis and St. Paul that we have partnerships with, and those community centers are, largely drawing in teenage kids from the neighborhood, and in both the community centers we deal with, they have large immigrant populations, and though the kids may tell you they know how to bike, it turns out that wherever they grew up, maybe they don't know how to bike and they don't know how to use the brakes, and so when you have your staff trained through in whatever way, it helps to deal with that and give some basic instruction on bike riding. Consequently, we've also separated that, and we do those community center programs separate from our general public programs so that we don't end up having that problem. Have a weather policy. We always say that the rides go rain or shine, but we don't go during lightning. One of the ways we also deal with this is we have a cell phone that in our rider letter we publish the cell phone number, and that participants, if they have any weather questions, can call the ranger after 9 o'clock in the morning of on that and say, hey, are we really going before we get in the car and come down there, or whatever it is. So that's been really helpful to have that weather policy in place. And generally, even if it is just raining, the participants tend to wimp out on their own, and you, as the ranger, don't have to end up making that call yourself. Routes are really important too. All 4 of our routes in some way, shape, or form are a loop, and so that is also why we've come down to the 4 routes we have, is that there's only a certain number of bridges over the river that you can piece together the right distance, and so that is how we've settled on that number. Is there's 4 good routes where we have 4 distances that work within our area, and also, of course, show off great pieces of our Mississippi River here. Starting locations have been an issue over the years for us because, again, here in the metropolitan area, you have to have a parking lot where people can come, because we found that most of our participants are driving from wherever they live with their car or their bikes on their car, and then they want to park for the length of the ride. And then you need to find a spot where they can park for a 3-hour time span, and also hopefully that spot is also free. So we've worked with some of our partner organizations to cut deals about using their parking lots and choosing starting locations that are a hair off the beaten path. Other than that, it's been a really successful program. I'd encourage any of you to try it. Our visitors love it, and we're going back in for another year. And if anybody has any questions right now, I'd be happy to answer them.
Great, thank you, Dan. If you have any questions, you can certainly type them in using the Q&A drop-down manager, or you can press *8 on your telephone keypad, and we can have you speak directly to the presenters themselves. It looks like we have one question so far and a comment too. Somebody from one of the FLMAs is actually providing some feedback and kudos about the importance of bike tours and having predetermined rides, and then asks, how is safety handled as far as encouragement and education?
Yeah, the safety question is a good one. I can't stress enough how helpful it is to put your leaders through some sort of formal bike training class. That really helped improve our safety. But also we worked with the Midwest region at the beginning, and one of my predecessors talked to a safety person there, and now we have a standard, short, simple safety message that we read before every bike tour that gives basic safety instructions, and again, we require helmets. So that's how we deal with it. I hope it's adequate. The only injury we've ever had on one of our rides was actually to one of the park rangers. Fortunately, it wasn't serious, but it hasn't been a big issue for us.
And along those lines, is there an MPS bike safety contact or course available to folks?
We have dealt with some of the other parks that have been offering similar programs, and so far as I know, everybody that has used a course has used the League of American Bicyclists course.
Great, thank you, Dan. And that looks like it's it for the questions at the moment. So, Natalie, I'll pass it back on to you.
Thank you, Amber. So, as I mentioned, the other component is education. And education is not just for motorists. It's really to teach pedestrians, bicyclists, and motors how to safely interact. And it can also be how to teach different types of non-motorized users how to safely interact. Here you'll see the Ridged Rivers, that's their logo out of Boise, Idaho. And I would encourage you to check out in one of your sources that you can download is a video that they have, which serves to basically teach users or explain to users that they need to interact with each other and kind of how to accommodate the different types of users, the bicyclists, the walkers. So I thought that was kind of an interesting and unique example of trying to promote that particular aspect. And As Dan mentioned, not everybody knows how to ride a bicycle, and so education can also take the component of teaching people how to properly maintain and ride a bicycle. One of the things that you hear often is bicycle rodeos are a great way where they, really take the time to kind of educate people on how to ride a bicycle properly. And one of those in particular is, children and people with limited bicycling experience are some of the areas that you might want to target. There are also bicycle enforcement programs. Of course, a benefit of it is because you don't have to use fuel because they're people-powered, and so there's a reduction in emissions. And it may also allow access to areas that are otherwise inaccessible by automobile patrols. And so the photo shown here is taken from Lake Clark National Park and Preserve, and they have kind of a bit of a unique experience, but I could imagine that with all the other areas there might be another kind of unique example. This inflatable raft that you see here, they actually deflate it when they're on a particular island and attach it to the bicycle, so then they can do their rounds, basically, checking things, doing their patrols and whatnot. And then when they want to go to the next island, they inflate it again, attach the bike, and they're on their way. So I thought that was a really unique example, and I'm sure you can think of other creative alternatives as well. There's basically bicycle enforcement programs or enforcement by bicycle that have been in some of the national parks, including Cape Cod National Seashore, Independence National Historical Park, and Valley Forge National Historical Park. This particular photo shown here is basically a training that was done by Greg Tinkham for some of those enforcement rangers. So as a poll question, which of the following programs has your unit or that which you are affiliated with initiated? We talked about the encouragement, so the tours, some education examples of bicycle rodeos, and enforcement by bicycle.
All right, looks like we have most of the results in, so I'm going to close the poll and show the results.
So it looks like we do have some examples of encouragement, education, enforcement programs, and maybe some people that don't have some. So I hope you take some of the ideas presented here. And again, I'll say that there's more additional examples. For those of you that maybe have some other examples that I don't know of, I would love to hear about them. So if you'd be willing to email me, and I would like to follow up with you and learn more. And then for the final section here, we're going to talk about the two final components, evaluate and monitor and plan updates. And in this section, you'll hear from Charles Borders about Mount Vernon Trail and Rock Creek Park. And we'll also hear again from Davis with some more insight from Red Hill. So evaluating and monitoring, it helps to document the effectiveness of plans, projects, and programs. Really, the data that feeds into goals, objectives, and performance measures is kind of discussed or incorporated into this particular section. And it can benefit plan updates and future projects based on the information that you've gathered. So now we're going to have Charles talk about Mount Vernon Trail and Rock Creek Park, and then afterwards Davis will go into how surveys can be used for evaluating and monitoring. So Charles, if you want to take it over.
Yes, thank you. So I am Charles Borders. I am a branch chief for the Denver Service Center duty station in Washington, D.C., and we deliver projects in the national capital and the southeast region. But today I'm going to be talking about projects and evaluating and monitoring in the national capital region and giving an overview of some projects on Mount Vernon Trail. One of the things that we're going to look at is the case study for the Mount Vernon Trail, the way data has been collected, some of the results and outcomes of that data collection, and how you can learn about the trail, and then how you would utilize that data to apply to the development and the design or the analysis of projects to improve the trail for the users or the nodes on those trails. So the first thing you have to do is collect the data. And one of the things that we've seen in the national capital region is the trail use has evolved over the years as systems like Red Bike, V-Bike. Red Bike has really established themselves in the monumental core and in the Washington, D.C. area. They're averaging about 200,000 trips a month. And a lot of those trips are on the Mount Vernon Trail as it's adjacent to the district. It's being used by them for commuting as well as recreation. Mount Vernon Trail in a lot of the higher volume areas sees about 81,000 trips in a month in the peak through the summer. And the Mount Vernon Trail is 18 miles long and runs from Arlington to through Alexandria to Mount Vernon home. So there's a couple different systems to collect the data that are on Mount Vernon Trail, and the one in the upper left, the diamond counter, is the traditional, that is the laser counter, and it just is like a tube counter that you might use for traffic. It just, you know, one tick is one use. The other system that is being incorporated more frequently is the eco counters, and it is a laser that's mounted on the pole. It has a box behind it, and then there is a loop that is cut into the road. So the big benefit of this kind of counter is it can differentiate between a pedestrian and a bicyclist. So it can really help analyze the types of users. It doesn't break down any further than that. That's where you get into the manual counts to verify and to supplement those counts. And as you see from this example of how you can analyze that data further, you could take the numbers that you receive from your eco counter and verify those in the mode split, and that you would have then break that down into the blue here is the female cyclist, the red would be the male cyclist, and then on down the line, female pedestrians, male pedestrians. And you could even go further in counting, you know, strollers, youth, adults, and so on and so forth. So there's obviously some pros and cons in either one of the systems. Some big benefits to the electronic counting is that it gives you the ability to identify high-density areas like we might have up by National Airport or Memorial Bridge, closer to the metropolitan area of the city. You get full data profiles. The biggest benefit is that you're counting 24/7 every day. You know, with the ego counter or some of them, you might have some weather influence, but you're capturing data all the time continuously. Some of the cons are you can't distinguish between age and gender. You've got some maintenance issues, and then there are some you know, some expenses associated with that. One of the good things about the eco counter is that you can coordinate within municipalities and jurisdictions. As an example, the Mount Vernon Trail GWMP coordinates with Arlington County. The eco counters are a little bit expensive, and it takes some installation to get them established on the trail. So pros and cons of the manual counting. The benefit is that you really can break down your demographic data, and you get personal observations of what is happening on the trail. The cons are that it takes a significant amount of time and effort, requires some organization by the staff to organize the volunteers, but one of the big benefits that you get out of it is that you can make it fun, and it's good PR for the park and for the trail users. In our observation, the personal observation, the manual counting, outweighs the time and investment for the results that you get in the application of that data. So the counting recommendations, to summarize, it really helps you understand the use of your trail. The trail counters, the automated use, you know, you get that 24/7, and then the manual counts just document and further verify the accuracy and give you more data and more information. You can find more information about this on BACPED documentation, and they also provide standards and reporting for the counts and keep a national database. So now that you've collected the data, as you start to analyze the ticks on the spreadsheet, you can see how your trail is actually being used day to day and on a weekend, and you really get to know the use of the trail. So in this particular graph, on the one on the top, the red line indicates the bicycle use, and the blue line indicates the pedestrian use. So in this particular day, in October, data was collected from October 4th to October 6th, and we averaged 2,600 trips along this route in this location in one day. But the thing that really presents itself is the two spikes in the morning. Trying to get the point. There we go. And then in the afternoon. So you can see that in the metropolitan area, and this location is mile 13, just a few miles from Memorial Bridge, that we have a rush hour on the Mount Vernon Trail, and particularly with the bicyclists. And then you can see a spike here in the middle of the day, and then in the afternoon with the pedestrians, and that's more of a recreation use, the runners. And then as we go to the weekend use on the trail on the bottom, the use pattern significantly shifts, and that it shows you that the runners and the walkers are out more in force in the morning, utilizing that trail, a dip at midday, and then you get a little bit of a spike later in the afternoon. But the bicyclists wait until later in the day to come out. But then the afternoon, when you're looking at 4,200 trips, nearly double what you had during the middle of the week, the type of user, particularly on the bicycle, significantly changes. Instead of the commuters headed north-south and with the determination of their direction, that you have people that are working from the nodes and the parking lots and more of a recreation type user. So you can see that once you collect that data and you start really analyzing the use patterns, it helps you understand how the trail is being used. So that location was right here at Dangerfield Island, mile 13, adjacent to National Airport. So to orient everybody where we are here, and I'm moving my arrow, but I'm not moving my. This is the district up here on the north end. National Airport. This is Alexandria, and down on the southern end, this is Mount Vernon, as you can see. So it's 18 miles of roadway. So if we roll all this data that we collect on a daily basis to this chart, you can see through the course of the trail, mile 2 to 16, as you head back up towards the District of Columbia, how these numbers are just amazing, the trips per day. So in mile 12, in that same location at Dangerfield Island, we're looking at 706,000 trips in a year through that area. So we're bordering on congestion on the trail with the commuting times and with the rush hour that you have. And if you just look even here in the middle of January, February, you're looking at 20,000, 30,000 trips through that middle section in a day or in a month. So one of the other things that we like to look at also is the speed data and how you would collect that and utilize this more as an education for the users. But you can also collect some data from this as it applies to the number of counts. So as you see that on the screen, the statistics, 70% of the cyclists traveled at or below 15 miles an hour. But we also found that Saturday morning speeds are highest, and that has the highest percentage of bikers speeding. But if you recall 2 slides back, the pattern of use that we saw on Saturday, the bicyclists in the morning were actually lower. Thank you for switching back there. You can see the use of the bicyclists didn't peak until the afternoon, but they're out in force going faster. So we'll move ahead now. Thank you. So even with that data, you can use that to reinforce some of the differences and the data that you've collected in just the raw counts. So then we can turn that data into additional pieces with the accident and crash data. But the problem with this is that it's junk in, junk out. Your accident data is only as good as the report is filled out. And if they're filled out with nodes or mile markers that you might have, then you can get accurate locations of where the accident occurred. But what we like to do is you'll look at a situation like this, and you've got a node here, mile 12, and then you have a bike-on-bike accident. So an explanation of what it was and then the resulting injury. But then you'll have a bike only, cyclist lost control around the curve, resulted in a head injury. But what we don't have from that particular accident report, if the report was filed by the injured person, if there was a ranger or a representative, did they interview properly? What caused that bicyclist? Was it a geometric an alignment issue? Was there something in the trail? Were they avoiding a pedestrian that might not have got accidentally reported? So you can see that you've got to get accurate information to identify that. But if you get consistent reports in nodes, then you're identifying your problem areas, and then that results in potential projects and modifications. So you can take that a little bit further, and we had a public health intern, Charles Oblock, who analyzed a lot of the data in the rates and crashes and rates of occurrence of these injuries, and then developed risk ratios for the different roadway crossing, transitions, trail intersections. And so you can see that the highest rate of crashes occurred with bicyclists only, but like I said, the asterisk to that of the small print is that was it user error, were there other influence that might have occurred? And so we're going to take a quick look over at some of the data that we've collected from Rock Creek and how that can be displayed a little bit differently, and that you can look at some of the data on that. So the highest percentage of accidents was classified as slips, trips, and falls at 23%, all the way down to, hit by a cyclist or, this poor one here at cardiac arrest. But you can really see that this one, surface transition, that's a geometric, is that a maintenance or is that a construction? That could be fixed. That's not a user error. So it identifies opportunities that you would have. So this is from a report developed by Jennifer Chang Dobson and Sarah Newman from the Washington office, the Public Health Office, and just we stuck this in there to compare some of the other interesting facts between Mount Vernon Trail, C&O Canal, and Cape Cod as to users and the ages of these users and the injuries that occurred within the age group. So there's multiple layers of how you can collect this data, and this might help a park or a unit identify areas that you can increase your education for a particular user group. So I'm always looking at, and I challenge the parks and the staff, how are you going to use this? Because we can collect stacks of numbers, but if it's just, you're inundated by the data. So how are you going to use this? So we use these in the development of long-range park plans, EAs, large-scale retrofits, grant applications. We've done some roadway safety audits, you know, regional trail safety outreaches, special events, daily operations. One of the things that it impacts us also is that if we have a construction project or an operation that might impact a trail, and we know that we have 4,000, you know, trips through there in a day, we have to make reasonable accommodation to reroute or detour those. And a lot of times, a mulch trail or sending them through the grass without numbers for a month isn't acceptable. So it gives you the data, the numbers to reinforce those decisions to maybe spend that money. So here's another example of how, you know, you can collect the data, the application of the data in our vehicle crossings. So this is just off of Mount Vernon Circle, and the trail crossing at the ramps has caused a lot of problems over the years. And so we've got the accident descriptions over on the right. There we go. And it kind of shows the incident. And so what has resulted from that is the photo on the left. This is the old trail alignment where the path crossed with 2 lanes of traffic. What we did is we can, you know, convince the park, develop the project and a philosophy to relocate that trail over to the right. There we go. Put in a taper, merging the traffic into 1 lane, which allows a easier crossing for the pedestrian and bicyclist to get across that ramp, resulting in them crossing much safer. We've seen a significant increase in even the conflicts in that area since we've done that this summer. There we go. So what we've learned from all of this is that you've got to leverage the resources. In a lot of these cases, utilize these as regional plans. Utilize the best counter technology that you can get, the eco counters, and then reinforce that with the analysis, your manual counters. Share the data that you have, particularly if you are in a metropolitan area or trail connections, and then identifying the application of that data, reaching sometimes outside of the box, you know, that you might not think to use trail data in the development or the reinforcement of a decision for a design project or an environmental assessment. And the biggest thing that I would suggest is documenting the trail by nodes, not by your parking lots or your destinations. Where you have trail crossings like this adjacent to the airport, where it's a complicated crossing and intersection, you know, this is just a concept that was developed to how that merge could be improved. So the recommendations, to recap, install the automated counters, use the best technology, reinforce your data collection with manual counters every year. To quote, you can learn a lot by watching a trail for 2 hours. And it's an incredible PR also, lets the users know that the land management agency owns that trail and is invested in the interest of improving that trail. And utilize the public health science to collect that crash data and analyze it in a risk safety mode. So we couldn't have done this without this long list of the count group here at George Washington Parkway in the Washington office. You know, just to recap, you know, I think that the biggest thing is that, you know, watch your trail and you can really identify how your trail is being used by utilizing this data.
Great, thank you, Charles. We do have a couple of questions. So again, to ask your questions, you can either use the Q&A drop-down manager or you can press *8 on your telephone if you're joining us via the telephone. There is one person from one of the parks who just wanted to reiterate the importance and how valuable the collection of data was in conducting their bike RSAs at Mount Vernon Trail, and somebody had wanted to know if there was some time at the end to ask all the presenters questions, and we will have some time for that as well. I just wanted to remind our audience too, we also have Karen Fink from Lake Tahoe who will be available at the end as well to answer some questions. And it looks like we have at least one question via telephone, and our first question is from Tucson. So Tucson, Arizona, if you'll hear a beep on your end, unmute your telephone and ask your question.
I'm Dick Schaefer. I'm formerly with the Federal Highway Administration. We did the bicycle road safety audit for Mount Vernon Trail, which is a wonderful opportunity, whether you do bicycles specifically for bikes or pedestrians for pedestrians, but you can do them on paths as well as roadways, and I surely recommend that federal land management agencies, both parks and others, use these more to really assess how they can basically use infrastructure, assess the infrastructure and improve the trail or roadway for bicyclists and pedestrians.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Schaefer. All right. Actually, that looks like it's all the questions for now. I think we're going to have quite a few questions at the end, so we're going to move along, and I'm going to pass the presentation back over to Davis.
Okay. What we're going to talk about here is the data collection process, the survey process that we performed on Red Hill. I mentioned initially that we did a report, final report we called it, for the Red Hill area, and that was funded in part by the town of Carbondale and in part by a local development. And part of that report was a survey, user survey, and we did that at the trailhead and probably had, I'm trying to remember, 100 plus surveys that were returned. There's an example there. You probably can't read it very well on the screen, but it had a series of questions that were practical from our perspective in terms of types of users, demographics, and so on and so forth. What we found initially was 71% of the users on Red Hill that we surveyed traveled 0 to 5 miles, meaning that they came out of Carbondale or came from close by locations. And I mentioned before, most of those folks probably drove to Red Hill, and at that time we didn't have a parking lot, so there wasn't much in the way of parking. People parked on the road. It was kind of a mess, actually. But they were close-in users. A vast majority of folks wanted to restrict activities on Red Hill to non-motorized use. And I would note that there really wasn't much motorized use up there anyway. There was an old road that was built to service a power line that went through the area, but it had grown in a lot and was mostly used by kids just to haul themselves up on the hill and have a bonfire and, have a party up there or something like that. Another piece of information we found was that use on Red Hill was increasing, and at that time it was obvious that use was increasing because folks were sort of finding out about Red Hill just through word of mouth. They noted that the original social trails were being expanded into more formalized trail networks, so that increased the interest on Red Hill. What we wanted to know was who our user population was, how they used it, whether it was for biking, walking dogs was a big one, and it remains a big one, and their frequency of use. How often were they going there, and other kinds of information. The importance of doing a survey initially for us was establishing a baseline of information about our user population. And as I mentioned, we were looking at sort of practical things as the Red Hill Council on Red Hill. About 4 years ago, BLM did another survey. We were hoping they were going to use our original survey form, but they opted to use a different one because the BLM, their recreation planners have a slightly different focus on management and management activities, and they used students from, I think, the University of Arizona to survey not only Red Hill but other recreation areas in the region. And their survey was not nearly as lengthy as ours, but was focused more on their management objective, recreation issues, types of experiences, things that they were focusing on as a governmental organization. The value of surveys and the value of surveys over time is to be able to analyze changing demands, understanding changes in user characteristics. These are very important as management tools for how you approach future planning and future activities in our area and frankly in any area that you're dealing with recreation users. Then about 3 years ago, and this was another exercise in engaging the community, we used students from the Colorado Rocky Mountain School, which is a private high school in Carbondale, and we went to one of their, a statistics teacher, and he was teaching a class in applied statistics, and I said, well, we've got a great project for you. You know, we've got our original survey. Let's modify it so it works for you and it's not maybe so lengthy, but still we can compare data collected from 3 years ago to 1996 when we did the original one. So the kids went out there, they did trailhead surveys, they surveyed folks at the local supermarket and other locations around Carbondale to gather information. One of the challenges with that was they focused a lot on people that were not at the trailhead, although they had a few trailhead surveys. They found that as people were getting out of their cars to go hike or bike, that they really weren't interested in stopping at that point and completing a survey, so they had to go to these other locations to gather the data. But in any case, it was a real-world exercise for the kids, the high school kids, and it was useful to the Red Hill Council as well as BLM as a comparison point to our original survey. So that was a really valuable piece of our process. So, you know, doing these kinds of follow-up surveys as time marches on and trying to use the same type of survey instrument that you used originally, if that's possible, is a good way to see how things change over time. I expect that folks will ask me what were some of the changes, and so I'll just touch on those a little bit. Use continues to increase. People were very satisfied about their experiences on Red Hill because it's a great place to go and it's close by, and you can either spend a full day up there recreating, or you can just simply do a lunch break or an early morning run or hike and get that kind of a workout. One of the other things that we found in the more current survey that the CRMS kids completed was that there was a demand for additional trails, and that's been a topic of discussion that we've had with BLM over the years. They kind of came in, we had our plan laid out, but it was an original design for trail locations. And on the Red Hill Council, we fully intended to try to expand the trail system, and BLM was kind of resistant to that. When they did their SRMA process, they included the existing trails that we had built and that we had planned, and that was kind of a snapshot in time, and it was their perception that we were done with trails. And so the survey information that we received from folks saying, hey, we would like an expanded system with more opportunities, it was a piece of information that we haven't been completely successful yet, but we have presented to BLM as future opportunities, future trail layout, so that we can expand and meet the needs of our public. And I think the value of using surveys and using surveys that are conducted with local high school students or folks like that, it's a real-world experience for them. It's academic, but it's something that is useful to an organization like ours. And I think other organizations that can incorporate student projects like this would do well, because it's something where the kids are engaged. They see that there are actual real world benefits of doing those kinds of things. So I would encourage anybody to use the survey process to document what's going on, and it's a good planning tool for the future. And that concludes my comments there.
So the next section and the final section is plan updates. So you have this wonderful plan, and of course, as things change, you want to make sure you do an update. So plan updates are a critical component, especially as you consider that the design standards are changing, as I discussed earlier. And then you want to also use it to identify areas for improvements, and of course, you want to identify your successes. A good time frame for considering plan updates is about every 3 to 5 years, and it's also very important to make sure that you identify the agency that's going to perform the updates, so there's not any confusion about that as well. So in conclusion, we started out talking about the many benefits that you can have from incorporating bicycle and pedestrian networks into the larger transportation network. We've talked about partnering and seeing why it's essential and mechanisms that can be used to do partnering. And we've highlighted how maintenance is a critical component of bicycling and pedestrian networks and plans. And we've also heard from Dan Dressler about a tour, which can help to encourage use of the facilities themselves. You've seen the highlights of the educational tool, a different type of tool that you can use for different things. I hope you guys all check that out at the end in the notes to see the tool that they used up in Boise, Idaho. And then finally, Charles Borders talked about how evaluating, monitoring, and collecting that data can really help to improve the bicycle and pedestrian network plan. And so he talked, specifically about the groups that might be targeted for education based on the data collected. And so in conclusion, I wanted to highlight the good practices to encourage bicycling and pedestrians in federal lands, which was the document that was basically used as this. In addition to some of the examples that you heard more in depth about today, there's also a whole bunch of other examples that are contained within the document, and I would encourage you to check it out. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of the specific reports that I've mentioned can be found in our resource library, and so the ones that you can find are here, and those have been discussed today, so I'd encourage you to also consult those if you want to learn more. And with that, I will send it over to Amber to see if we have any more questions.
Great, thank you, Natalie. So at this point, if you have any questions for any of our presenters, you can type them in the Q&A drop-down manager. You can press *8 if you're joining us via the telephone to speak to them directly. Actually, Charles, it looks like we have one question for you. If you could describe some of the challenges for using volunteers for manual counts.
Well, just like any volunteer activity that you have, it really comes down to the organization and the pre-planning. A lot of the things that we've developed here also is limiting the number of volunteers to a manageable group, having a clear identification of what the goal is for the day, and the organization of rolling them out on that day. We've got the spreadsheets, and so you really just a little training seminar on how to count. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it really falls into any category of volunteer activity in a park.
Thank you, Charles. I just wanted to remind everybody as well that today's PowerPoint presentation, as well as all of the resources mentioned, are available in the handouts section of Live Meeting, which is in the top right-hand corner of your screen. It looks like 3 white pieces of paper. I believe we do have one telephone question from Jackson, Wyoming. So Jackson, you will hear a beep on your end, and you'll have to unmute your telephone to ask your question directly.
This is John Christensen, Grand Teton National Park. In the Red Hill survey, can you speak to a little bit about what role, if any, the Office of Management and Budget and their survey approval process played into your survey? Were you able to do that separate from the BLM without needing to go through that process, or was that part of your survey process?
On our first survey, we didn't really go through that process. In fact, we didn't even know it existed, to be honest with you. When the BLM did their survey, they went, completely through that process because it was a survey they put together and they had to work through their channels. On the CRMS survey, they reviewed it, but didn't really change a whole lot because it was an abbreviated version of the original survey. So it wasn't a big obstacle for us or anything. It was a challenge.
All right. Well, while some of the other questions are pouring in, well, there's actually one for Dan, and it is, how long does it take to develop a route?
That's a really good question about how long it takes to develop a route. It kind of depends. The most recent route that we've developed is a new one. We took a University of Minnesota student who was looking for some volunteer work in the field, and we knew the general area that we wanted the route to center around, and so we asked him to go out and map out a proposed route complete with interpretive stops. And even though he wasn't an experienced interpreter, he had, gave us, mile markers and all that. And once he came back with that package, then we send out one of our more experienced interpreters to ride the route with him and finalize the route there. So even if you include the volunteer time and the research time, I would really say it was only, maybe 3 days worth of work. And it was really nice because it was an area of the park where our interpreters already knew the background interpretive information, so that part wasn't hard.
All right, and it looks like we have one more question, and it is, could Natalie go over the Jackson Hole and Acadia National Park maintenance programs a little bit more in detail?
So for the Jackson Hole one, the one plan that I referenced specific to Jackson Hole, they talked about basically making use of volunteers or volunteers or organizations to help basically, I think, clean up the debris that might be associated with the trails to make them, enjoyable and usable. So it's kind of more of a low level. We talked about the different types of maintenance, so that was kind of more that one. It's not the more in-depth maintenance types. And with regards to Acadia National Park, so a little bit more details. Acadia National Park works with the Friends of Acadia, and essentially my understanding is that the park itself had a grant, and the Friends of Acadia, which is their friends group, used their network to raise money to match that grant. And so then they put that money into essentially an account that grows interest, and it's managed by the Friends of Acadia through that. And then every year the interest that's earned, they take that and they put it towards maintenance. And so there's actually an agreement in place between the two entities for the Friends of Acadia to manage that particular money. And I believe the document actually contains the agreement that's between the two, and it even contains a more in-depth discussion of those. So I would encourage you to check that out as well.
And Charles, one question for you. How much do different counters cost?
The whole install for the eco counter, I believe they're about $3,000. And then you've got to get them, installed, but maintenance, your local unit maintenance could do that.
Great. And Davis, do you put signs up at the trailheads prior to and during volunteer days?
Yes, we do. We post the trailhead. We just make 11 by 17 signs, laminate them, put them up there. And as I mentioned before, we'll put some in the supermarket, some restaurants around town, and locations where people might see them.
All right. That actually looks like we've answered all of the questions that have come in so far. And I just wanted to provide an opportunity to any of our presenters if they wanted to have any last closing remarks before we conclude.
Natalie, this is Charles.
Go ahead, Charles.
Well, one of the things, just to add to the eco counter, we've chosen to use one that's compatible with the communities in the area, Arlington County to be specific. The best ones are not made in the United States, but there is documentation, sole source justification to purchase those from Canada. And if anybody's interested in the cut sheet on that or the name of the ones that we use. And they've got a direct link to a computer system as well. So, you know, it's very handy. I can provide that if anybody wants to send me an email.
Great. And if you are interested in that, if you just type a question in the Q&A drop-down manager, and we'll put you in touch with Charles. All right, so that looks like it concludes our presentation today for the Paula Sarbanes Transit and Parks Technical Assistance Center. Here is our web address as well as our email address and telephone number should you have any questions. I specifically wanted to thank Natalie, Davis, Stan, and Charles for presenting today. It takes a lot of time and effort to pull this together, and we truly appreciate all of the hard work that you've put into this. Thank you to all of our participants. A recording of today's webinar will be available on our website in about a week or so. And we conclude today's webinar presentation. Thank you again and have a great day.